On Saturday, the 1st of February 2025, the United States of America kicked two of its closest allies in the teeth. Making good on a highly controversial, highly divisive campaign promise, newly minted 47th President Donald Trump continued his political comeback tour by slapping a substantial set of tariffs on the closely allied nations of Canada and Mexico. China got slapped with its own tariffing in what amounted to an outright challenge to the powers that be in Beijing. Within minutes, the international community was in uproar. Within minutes of Monday morning opening, stock markets were tumbling, and within 48 hours, Washington had suspended its tariffs on Mexico before they even began, whereas Canada made clear its willingness to go blow for blow. The Wall Street Journal editorial board, typically quite happy to position itself as a friend to Trump's conservative movement, called it, quote, the dumbest trade war in history. In short, it's been a rather unusual few days, in the sort of upheaval that was both entirely predictable, after all Trump promised this very thing, and simultaneously shook the foundations of the international order. But today on WarFronts, we're not going to focus so much on the precise back and forth of America's newest dust-up. Instead, we're going to talk about a much greater, much darker spectre that's been looming for months: a trade war. Today, we're going to endeavor to explain everything you need to know about trade wars, what they are, how they happen, whether they can evolve into real wars, and what ordinary people, like all of us, can do if any of our respective countries get wrapped up in one. No matter how this ongoing dust-up in Washington plays out, the broader reality is that we're headed into not just months, but years, where trade wars are going to become very important. So, might as well get prepared for the inevitable. Alright, let's start with the bare basics. What precisely is a trade war? Well, put really simply, a trade war is a conflict fought between at least two nation-states, although sometimes more, via the use of economic measures rather than traditional means of warfighting. Guns and bullets are replaced by taxes and tariffs, naval battles and air wars are replaced by blockades and prohibitions, and real-world battlefields are replaced by what essentially amounts to wars fought through paperwork. Nation A wants to cause harm to Nation B, so Nation A attacks the economic interests of Nation B, and because it's very difficult in a practical sense for nations to reach directly into each other's domestic economies, Nation A instead attacks Nation B's interests when they're at their most exposed. And that would be when those assets are traded internationally, meaning that they're subjected to influences that whatever nation you're trying to harm lacks the means to control. Now, in order for an economic spat to be properly called a trade war, it's got to fulfill two basic criteria. It's got to be of a certain scale, and it's got to be mutual. Trade wars are an order of magnitude above what's called a trade dispute, meaning some large-scale diplomatic and economic disagreement that would require two countries to work out major differences around an item of mutual interest. If, say, Nation A wants to sell coffee beans to Nation B, but Nation B insists on paying much less than Nation A is asking for, that's a trade dispute, it's not a trade war. And even a trade dispute is just a particularly high-stakes version of the trade disagreements that take place constantly all across the world. For something to rise the level of a trade war, it's going to involve two or more sides placing steep, wide-ranging demands on each other that each side knows is going to lead to real economic hardship for their adversaries, not just in one single industry or for one single group, but across the board. And trade wars go two ways. If, say, a very powerful Nation A decides to blockade a very weak Nation B until it crumbles, then that's much less an actual trade war than a simple show of trade-based bullying. In a trade war, all participating nations have the means to cause economic harm to each other, and they leverage those means against each other in hopes that their opponent will break first. So, why would a trade war happen? Well, really, any answer to that question will depend on the trade war in question. But there are a few key reasons why nations might choose to interact in this way. Sometimes, like a bitter married couple having a knockdown drag-out fight because one of them tracked a bit of dirt onto the freshly swept floor, the trade war is actually about more than the trade war itself. A country might want to extract broader concessions from an adversary, force a political change, compel their adversary to do something it doesn't want to do, or avoid something it does want to do. Basically, a trade war can be a way to force a broader victory or defeat without anyone actually having to die over the issue at hand. Nation A tells Nation B, I want that really nice patch of land near my border, and I'm going to ruin your economy till you give it to me. Or, an opposite example from the real world, NATO nations don't like Russia invading Ukraine, so they're going to sanction the hell out of Russia until it agrees to play nice. Sometimes a trade war is a facet of a much larger international conflict, perhaps a hot war where Nation A and Nation B both have the troops and infrastructure to sustain a years-long fight, so they each try to collapse each other's economies so that the war effort collapses underfoot. Perhaps it's part of a competition between superpowers. Going to a real-world example again, America and the Soviet Union frequently leveraged economic weapons against each other as part of the Cold War. Or sometimes the trade war really is just about trade. Nation A wants to pay a fairer or more favorable price for something Nation B has, Nation B refuses to lower costs, and Nation A decides to cause hardship across Nation B's economy with the expectation that things will go back to normal once it gets what it wants. Nation B, in that case, would try to do the same thing to Nation A, again making this a proper trade war instead of just trade bullying. Regardless, the one constant of a trade war is that by definition it involves economic hardship for all participants. Much like a real war, where troops from all sides are going to fight and die for something, a trade war is all about imposing costs on an adversary that are harder for that adversary to bear than the cost that your adversary places on you. For example, in this most recent exchange with Mexico, Canada, and China, the Trump administration made clear that their intent isn't to simply escape economic pain for Americans, but to endure that pain, with the expectation that the opposing side will break first. Said Trump via an all-cap social media post, and yes, I'm going to deliver this how he wrote it, because everyone knows that caps on the internet is shouting, "Will there be some pain? Yes! Maybe and maybe not, but we will make America great again! And it will be worth the price that must be paid." It's nice to flex the old dramatic muscle sometimes. Look, in some cases, trade wars of a certain size will have ripple effects all around the world, harming supply chains that run through other countries and producing economic hardship and breakdown for people who stand to gain little from any of the possible outcomes. But in most cases, that hardship simply won't be alleviated until some party within a trade war gets its way. All right, so that's the what and the why of a trade war, but what about the how? Practically speaking, it's not unheard of for trade wars to I just think every all caps Trump tweet from now on, I'm going to shout. But that sort of intervention is mostly an artifact of history. It was much easier, for example, to implement a literal blockade if an ancient Greek city-state wanted to park its navy in the harbor of a neighboring rival than it would be for modern-day America to blockade modern-day China or vice versa. Some nations, and even non-state actors, have the ability to attack trade via their control over specific trade routes. Panama could try and shut down the Panama Canal, for example, or Turkey could lock down the Bosporus Strait and throttle the nations of the Black Sea. Or, in an example that's actually within this decade, the Houthi rebels of Yemen could attack global trade as it passes through the critical Red Sea. Aside from those sorts of examples, though, most trade wars are fought via paperwork, by putting up barriers around an adversary's ability to either export the goods it produces or import the goods that it needs. Now, look, this isn't an economics channel, and we are not economists, so instead of going through the economic theory behind each of these implements, we're going to focus on what they mean in a practical sense for people in places where they are implemented. For those of you among our viewers who are economics nerds, we encourage you to tell us in the comments about the intricacies you might consider to be worthy of knowing. Anyway, there are a range of tools the nations can use in a trade war, but there's one really big one that we'll talk about at length, so let's run through some of the other important ones first. A trade embargo is an outright ban on the trade of a certain good to or from a certain country. If, say, South Korea makes tons of money selling cars to Canada, but Canada is mad at South Korea for whatever reason, Canada can embargo all imports of South Korean cars. You can embargo one specific type of good at a time, or you can embargo a range of goods all at once. Typically, that will deliver a swift and pretty sizable hit to whatever nation is on the receiving end, while its detrimental effects for the nation issuing the embargo are typically easier to stave off. Nations can also subsidize their own producers. For example, if China sells Huawei phones to India, but India wants to cause some economic pain for China, then India can pay more money to its own cell phone producers in order to help them become competitive or even preferred for Indian consumers, meaning that Huawei would lose out on lots of revenue that it would otherwise be expecting. Countries can also issue quotas on their own imports and exports. If Chile, for some reason, gets into a shouting match with the European Union, one of the major customers for the massive amounts of copper that Chile produces, then Chile might choose not to cut off copper completely, but instead cut the EU's copper supply in half, threatening to cut off the rest unless Europe plays nice. Importer nations can impose quotas too. Indonesia buys tons of cloves from the nation of Madagascar, but it also produces lots at home as well. So if Indonesia wants to place pressure on Madagascar for whatever reason, it can set limits on the number of cloves that Indonesian importers can purchase from Madagascar. But over the coming few years, the biggest trade weapon to worry about is the tariff. Now, any regular consumers of US-adjacent media are well acquainted with Donald Trump's love of the tariff, and might even be familiar with how that love seems to be rooted in an admiration for America's 25th president, expansionist, and noted short king William McKinley. And if that happens to be your media diet, then you've probably also had an endless string of "what are tariffs" news articles shoved at you. But for those among our viewers who haven't had that pleasure, these are the basics. A tariff is a tax on imports. That is to say, it only can be levied against goods that the nation charging the tariff is bringing to their own soil. Every incoming good has a price, and a tariff charges an additional fee, usually a percentage of the price instead of a set figure, that must be paid before that item enters the country. If an American importer expects to pay $20 for a bottle of fine Irish whiskey, but the US government implements a 50% tariff on all goods coming from Ireland, then in total, that importer will need to shell out $30 before they've got their bottle in hand. Nations can, by the way, implement other forms of customs duties that are basically the opposite of a tariff, placing a charge on a good moving out of their own territory, rather than charging goods as they come in. So, those are some of the more popular mechanisms to fight a trade war, but there's also the question of impact, because much like a war of bullets and bombs, a trade war comes with casualties for everyone. Because a trade war is economic, its consequences will be too, and there's no easy way for a participating government to control who gets hurt. For example, if a nation's auto industry is caught up in a trade war, then auto companies, their employees, and people looking to buy a car are all going to suffer, and often they'll suffer more than the politicians running the trade war will. On the other hand, nations will often advertise a trade war to their people by emphasizing the potential upside for domestic business. After all, if a domestic company is undercut on price by foreign competition, but that foreign competition suddenly goes away, then those domestic companies should get much more business. Tariffs and other economic measures can even funnel massive sums of money into the governments that institute them, and in an ideal world, those revenues will bring prosperity all across a given nation. But unfortunately, it's usually not so clean-cut in practice. If, say, French clothing manufacturers supply 1/4 of all clothes in France versus 3/4 of imports, then a tariff that makes all those imports too expensive to compete does mean that French-made clothing will be much more in demand. But starting new businesses, opening enough factories and production lines, hiring enough workers, and building enough transport and selling infrastructure to meet 100% of France's clothing needs would take years. It is a messy, expensive, and highly inefficient process, and one that risks slowing down their own economy. For most people in the meantime, well, let's just say it's lucky that French law doesn't explicitly require people to cover up. Similarly, governments often give false or misleading impressions to businesses or the public around tariff law, like what's playing out in the United States right now. Despite Donald Trump's insistence on the campaign trail that tariffs on foreign goods would be paid by foreign countries, it's not actually how tariffs work, and it's American importers who will have to pay more to access the goods that they'd like to import. Nor will these importers just eat the costs themselves. They'll upcharge their product for whoever buys their goods, and so on until eventually that price increase is slapped on a store label for the one person who can't pass those price increases off to somebody else: the ordinary consumer. Alright, now, in all of this discussion of trade wars, it's important to consider just how seriously people should take the second half of the phrase, specifically that nasty little label there of war. On the bright side, trade wars don't need to ever actually turn violent, and in many cases the entire reason that nations will opt for a trade war is that it allows them to avoid a real war. But unfortunately, it's not uncommon for trade wars to devolve into real wars, and we'd be remiss if we didn't emphasize the reasons that in today's world it's entirely fair to worry that a trade war today could mean violence tomorrow. Sometimes a conventional war will start in order to stop a trade war. Imagine a conflict between a rich nation that has a small military and a poor nation that has a big military. The nation with lots of money but very few troops will do better in a trade war, while the nation with lots of troops but very little money will do better in a conventional war. So, if the poor but well-armed nation is getting its arse handed to it in a trade war, it might choose to simply march troops onto its adversary's soil. In a more common example, a nation that's getting the worst end of an ongoing trade war and facing a lot of public pressure and resentment from its own people might try and funnel that anger into a military campaign against the adversary imposing such difficult trade penalties. That's especially likely if a nation's leaders believe they can't win via economic means, but that they can attain a military victory. Sometimes as well, a trade war could take place simultaneously with a conventional war, either directed toward the same target or directed toward other adversaries that play an indirect role in the conflict. If, for example, China and the United States will go to war tomorrow over Taiwan, it's unlikely that either Beijing or Washington would be in a rush to drop a nuclear bomb on each other's mainland territory, but it's much more likely that each would attempt to harm each other economically at home while simultaneously fighting a war in the Pacific. Or if Iran and Israel went to war, but Israel noticed that Iran seemed to be getting a lot of help from the UAE, Israel might start up a trade war with the UAE in order to both deter the Emirates from their efforts and make it harder for Iran to have success if the Emirates stop playing an active role in the conflict. At other times, a trade war might come before a real war, in a strategic attempt to soften up an adversary, level the playing field, or extract concessions that make a conventional war easier in the future. If Russia decides one day that it wants to launch another full-scale invasion of tiny Georgia, it might start by launching a trade war to cripple the Georgian economy, making it both more difficult and less appealing for Georgia to take an even greater risk and fight back once Moscow's tanks start rolling southward. In an opposite scenario, if Ethiopia fears it might be invaded by Egypt seeking control of the source of the River Nile, then Ethiopia might launch a trade war preemptively, trying to economically diminish Egypt to the point that it'll either be easier to beat in an eventual confrontation, or to the point that it might even reconsider the value of starting a war at all. Or if the US and China each get the sense that they're on the doorstep of World War III, they might try to wage economic war first in hopes of seizing an early advantage that they can use as momentum later. Finally, there's the scariest way of all for a trade war to turn hot: destabilization. We refer to this as one of the scariest outcomes, partially because it's the most likely to happen at a given time, and partially because it's so hard to predict or control. As we've explained, the ramifications of a trade war are typically going to be felt, and sometimes quite deeply, by the ordinary people of the nations involved. Sometimes social order, individual financial stability, collective wealth, and contingency options for a given nation are strong enough that their people can weather a trade war and still be okay at the end. But that's not always the case. Sometimes a trade war will drive vast numbers of people into poverty as jobs and trade revenues disappear, or will see the masses lose out on critical resources because they're too expensive to access. In situations like that, trade wars can lead to rapid and sometimes profound destabilization, as populations prepare to revolt or rebel against a government that's committed to the trade war, driving people into despair, or go hungry because the weak domestic institutions of their nation can't recover from the damage. That's a situation we could play out in any number of directions. Take modern-day Mexico, for example, where trade with the US is critical and where large portions of the country are dominated by powerful drug cartels. As more people lose their legitimate sources of income, and as the state loses the wealth it relies on to help people in need, people will do what they need to do in order to survive, perhaps turning to the cartels and supporting them in exchange for protection, or perhaps even joining them in large numbers to make ends meet. Or take Iran, where large-scale protests in the last few years have already shaken society to its core. If Iran got into a difficult trade war tomorrow, it's not clear that its ruling regime would survive. And although opponents of Iran's revolutionary government would call that a victory, there's no telling what sort of civil violence could break out as a result. And in fact, trade wars between a subset of countries can have severe effects in far-flung corners of the globe. Take, for example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, one of the only nations to produce cobalt, which is sold, in turn, predominantly to China for use in electronics, electric vehicles, and more. If China and the US get into a trade war and the end result is that China's electronics and electric vehicle industries are crippled, then the DRC loses its main customer for cobalt, and the millions of people who barely survive today thanks to the brutal cobalt mining industry in their home country could quickly lose what is basically their only lifeline. A trade war between nations A and B today might lead to a revolution in nation C tomorrow, civil breakdown in nation D the day after that, and a terror attack against nation A from embittered insurgents in nation D 10 years down the road. When the global economy goes through an upheaval, it's hard to tell who's going to be hurt until the results start to show, and it can take years, even decades, for those ripple effects to finally calm down. Suffice it to say, trade wars are neither a thing to take lightly nor a simple economic fight without any real-world consequences. So, if a trade war has such potential to lead to bad outcomes, it begs the question, how do trade wars end? And just as importantly for ordinary people who might be caught up in those trade wars, how can you make a trade war end? Unfortunately, some of them end in ruin, as we've just laid out. Some ends with a clear victory for one side and a crippling defeat for the other, with results that can run the gamut from a complete re-evaluation of national priorities to a spike in poverty and hunger to internal destabilization to invasion or hot war by an aggressive adversary. Some, from the perspective of some nations, do end with something you could call a victory, although in practice, most of those victories will still be bittersweet. It's certainly not impossible that a nation could emerge from a trade war having maximized its own domestic advantages, stimulated growing industries on their own territory, and extracted major concessions that will benefit that country for years and decades to come. It's not exactly a common ending, but it's not unheard of. As for when a trade war ends, however, there are three major possibilities. Maybe the nation that started the trade war gets what it wants and unilaterally declares a return to normal. Maybe the countries engaged in a trade war keep on pushing and straining until finally somebody's economy breaks, and whatever happens after that ends up happening. Or maybe nations engaged in a trade war are forced to reckon with the fact that for their own people, the current conditions are simply not sustainable, and that if a government can't change those conditions for their people, those people might start thinking about changing their government. This is a trick that works a lot easier in nations that run on some form of free and fair electoral politics. And in fact, it's a big reason why, at least until now, many powerful nations held off engaging in full-scale trade wars. If there's one constant shared by every citizen of every country on Earth, it's that the people hate it when you mess with their economy, and they will punish those responsible if they have the means to do so. As a result, public pressure is historically quite good at stopping trade wars once they start, and it's been even better at preventing trade wars from starting in the first place. It is not a perfect system by any means, but it is the best tool in much of the world's arsenal. This works within non-electoral political systems as well, from monarchies to autocracies to all manner of non-representative leadership. Public outcry will have to be a lot louder in those cases and a lot more forceful, but generally speaking, it can get the job done. If a nation's citizens can demonstrate to its government that the political costs of continuing a trade war are greater than the political costs of ending a trade war, then that trade war becomes significantly more likely to end, even if it might not end on favorable circumstances. So, as we wrap up today's special episode, it's worth taking the time to ask one final question today. If you, dear viewer, happen to find your own nation wrapped up in a trade war, what should you do? Well, the first step, just like the first step of a person headed into any large-scale societal event, is to prepare as best you can with the time that you have. If a trade war with another nation appears to be on the horizon, take the time to get educated on what exactly that nation provides to your own, what exactly your nation provides to them, and what, if anything, your officials are saying about just how far they're willing to go in order to attain victory. If you rely on a staple good, a medication, or another important item from that other nation, consider building a stockpile in advance or working out alternatives ahead of time to form a plan if what you need suddenly becomes unavailable. If you don't have alternatives in your own country or via other trade pathways, prepare to spend an outsized proportion of your budget. If you're planning a large-scale purchase of something made in a country you're about to have a trade war with, whether it's a car or a specialty piece of electronics or whatever the case may be, consider either purchasing early or ensuring that you can delay that purchase long enough to ride out the rise and subsequent fall of prices that will come when a trade war begins or ends. And even if you don't rely on any of the goods you expect to be impacted, prepare for unexpected price increases in other areas as your own domestic markets and the international trade landscape both shift to cope with this new reality. If a trade war is ongoing and you'd like it to end, then think carefully about the methods available to you in the place that you live. If you're in a representative democracy of some kind, then organize. Contact your designated representatives and work to build public pressure to incentivize your government officials to turn back. Conversely, if you happen to like the trade war you're involved in or perceive it as advantageous to you, then do the opposite and let your government know that they've got your support. If you are going to advocate that a trade war ends, think carefully about what comes after. The difference between stopping today and stopping tomorrow might be the difference between better or worse circumstances in a newly modified trade arrangement for the foreseeable future. And finally, if you live in a place where government institutions are weak or unpopular, where many people are a lost job away from poverty, or where you believe that you simply aren't equipped to win a trade war, then create contingencies in the case of destabilization and hardship across society. If you can reasonably conclude that the ramifications of a trade war might leave your country and community significantly worse off, then don't just wait for that reality to set in. If you can take action or build a plan to get ahead of it, then do so, because once a process of destabilization begins, it's difficult to know what parts of society are going to undergo radical, unexpected change. Here at WarFronts, we certainly hope that the factors we're observing that seem to suggest that trade wars around the world are becoming more likely will ultimately breeze past our civilization without incident. But hoping for that outcome, and assuming that outcome, two very different things. And if the harsh realities of a trade war ultimately do become part of your life, we hope that such a world is a little bit more navigable than it might have otherwise been. Thank you for watching.